Hello. Thank you so much, Marta. We will be turning to our next presenter. If we can just get her PowerPoint loaded up. This is also a paper on the Holocaust, also very fresh research, but a very different story. So I hope that actually we have a chance for these two presenters to speak ultimately to each other. We'll be hearing from Raisa Ostapenko from Sorbonne, yes, who is a PhD candidate, and she will be presenting her research to risk one's life for another, the moral psychology of rescuing Jews during the Holocaust in occupied Ukraine. Raisa, thank you.
This one? Thank you. Thank you so much. So what a brilliant presentation, first of all. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Very powerful. I'm taking I'm talking about something, the other side of the coin, about Ukrainians who risk their lives to rescue Jewish victims of the Holocaust. So my doctoral research is focused on the rescue activities, methods, motivations, and moral psychology of ethnic Ukrainian rescuers of Jewish victims of the Holocaust in Eastern Galicia and the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. And while a substantial focus of my larger project is an inquiry into the nitty-gritty of how people rescued and the various questions that emerge from that understanding, this paper addresses the question of why, under an occupation where rescuing was punishable by death, some bystanders were able to become rescuers, while others, amongst them even ethical, non-prejudiced individuals, were not. And this is arguably the most difficult question I pose in my doctoral research, and this paper is a preliminary attempt to both evaluate the applicability of past studies on rescue work to the Ukrainian context and determine whether moral philosophy and selected research on moral psychology can offer a useful framework to better understand the factors that drove rescuers to and through their wartime activity. But before proceeding to my arguments, I'd like to engage in an experiment of sorts. It's an exercise in empathy, and I'm hoping that this will enable you to better assess the validity of my observations. So before proceeding to my arguments, I'd like to invite you to accompany me on a visualization. This scenario will play out in your mind privately, so I implore you to engage with it without moral judgment. There are no right answers, and please free yourself from any preconceived notions of what socially acceptable behavior is. Please make yourself amenable to whatever sequence of events intuitively arises in you. You are the 32-year-old parent of two small children, a 7-year-old girl and a 4-year-old boy, both quietly sleeping. You, your spouse, and your children live with your elderly parents in your childhood home. Night has fallen, but your spouse has yet to return home, having left early in the morning to barter a selection of household possessions, some of great sentimental value, for food and supplies in a village half a day's walk away. The war and the occupation, now raging for the better part of a year, have left your family wanting for basic goods. Conditions continue to worsen as the Nazis and their local collaborators become ever harsher, requisitioning everything from eggs to gardening equipment. There's little you can do to avoid it. Your house is visible. Just 4 doors down from the schoolhouse the occupants have transformed into their headquarters. Early this morning, all your Jewish neighbors were rounded up and marched by column from the town center into a nearby forest. Your ears still ring from every shot and haunting scream of the terrible massacre. No one came to their rescue. Nobody could, not without paying a price. You fidget about. The anxiety has become suffocating, when suddenly you hear a muted knock. Thank heavens. You rush to let your loved one in, but see instead a stranger, breathing heavily, his cheeks hollowed and body stained with dirt and blood. He reaches out a trembling hand and says, "Please, help me. I beg of you, please let me in." Save my soul. What do you do? So on the basis of my empirical evaluation of nearly 1,100 Yad Vashem recognized rescue accounts from the Ukrainian context and countless rescue accounts from across Europe, I have come to several arguments and conclusions regarding the moral psychology of rescuers. Namely, number one, that most people who chose not to rescue Jews ultimately acted, either consciously or not, against their intuitive understanding that killing, enabling killing, or failing to prevent killing are harmful and therefore immoral, while rescuers, by contrast, acted in accordance with said understanding. So, why did I come to that first conclusion? Because the very landscape of the Holocaust by bullets in Ukraine made it very unlikely for people to be unaware of what was happening to their Jewish neighbors. From ghettoization to people being marched from the center of town or from wherever past a Ukrainian's house into a nearby field or into a forest, just made it impossible for people not to be aware. Not to mention, this violence was so intimate. It occurred essentially in Ukrainians' very backyards. People could hear the screams of victims dying, the volley of a firearm while boiling potatoes on the stove. And ultimately, human beings, and this has been supported by studies in moral psychology, human beings universally understand that things that cause harm are, well, we can say immoral, right? We can understand that harm is immoral. So the fact that human beings were able to stand by while other people, other human beings, were being harmed suggests that they were acting against an intuitive understanding of what is the proper and moral behavior. And the reason that this is likely to have occurred is a complex social cognitive mechanism that was first proposed by a psychologist called Albert Bandura, called moral disengagement. And moral disengagement is the process by which a human being grows to disengage from the self-regulation that ordinarily ensures moral conduct, to the extent that he or she can violate his or her moral standards, all the while maintaining a sense of self-worth. Now, the sense of self-worth was a very important argument for Bandura because he maintained that humans are moral specifically because of their assessment of themselves. In order to maintain a sense of respect for yourself as a human, you act morally. So this complex process makes humans able to observe or commit immoral acts, all the while not feeling the emotional consequences of this behavior, and thereby making them tolerable. Now, this is very consistent with the things that I've observed as a researcher. I've come to see that people who chose not to rescue ultimately experience two defense mechanisms: intellectualization and rationalization. And the intellectualization is when a person resorts to thinking over feeling to ease the emotional stress of an unconscious conflict. And rationalization is when a person makes a sufficiently logical argument to justify a poor decision. And Bandura basically identified several examples of these psychosocial maneuvers that people submit themselves to when they decide not to do something that they consider moral. So moral justification, sanitizing language, the idea that you have no personal agency in a specific situation, and of course, dehumanization of the victim. The second premise of this paper, and the second argument that I've ultimately come to, is that the decision to rescue, if we go back to your visualizations, whether you chose to rescue or not, the decision that was made instantaneously was very much an emotional decision. And what followed was an intellectual process. So this is consistent with the latest research in moral psychology. There's a psychologist called Jonathan Haidt who wrote a very interesting book called The Righteous Mind, which has been met with some controversy, but it's also been met with great celebration. And so one of the fundamental premises of his work is that intuitions come first and strategic reasoning second. And that's very much consistent with the rescuer accounts that I have either read or that I have procured through interviewing. And the idea is that when people chose not to rescue, the decision not to rescue was very much intuitive, and it was followed by all of these this moral disengagement that I've already addressed. I think that the decision to rescue was also extremely intuitive, and it was similarly followed by intellectual processes, one of which was a similar form of rationalization where rescuers justify to themselves precisely why they chose to rescue. For example, they said, well, you know, Jews are humans too. Or they said, my mother's Jewish, or but she's my wife, but this is my relative. And these justifications often survived the war, survived the occupation, actually became the motivations that people cited. I call them self-ascribed motivations for rescuing, to justify why they rescued. For example, Judeophilic rescuers would say, well, I love Jews. You know, Jews are so important, so of course that's why I rescued them. But Jonathan Haidt, in saying that intuitions come first and strategic reasoning second, actually looks at strategic reasoning as a justification for your instincts, for your intuitive actions, which is precisely why I take the motivations that people have expressed to me at face value. I think that motivations are extremely important, and they've actually enabled me to organize my research and to make it intellectually very manageable because of the sheer volume. It makes it intellectually comprehensible to organize rescuers, I suppose, in terms of patterns of behavior and methodology. But the fact is that I found that self-ascribed motivations and researcher-ascribed motivations are simply insufficient to understand why people chose to rescue. So before I go into some other ideas, I'd like to establish that there are a lot of significant sociological work has actually been done the work in psychology has been done on the motivations behind rescue work, and very important researchers, amongst them Perry London, Nechama Tech, the Alleners, who are a husband and wife, Eva Fogelman, all of whom represent Nechama Tech and the Alleners represent Holocaust survivors, and Eva Fogelman belongs to, she is the child of Holocaust survivors. So these were very much personal experiences for the researchers in question. And they all came to this fundamental understanding of the altruistic personality.
She's got 2 more minutes.
Of this altruistic personality, so people who are extremely altruistic and just sacrifice themselves. I'll accelerate. Basically, in my research, having interviewed plenty of rescuers, I was shocked to see some rescuers behaving in ways that I thought were inconsistent with the idea of being a perfectly altruistic personality. For some reason, some rescuers were very petty at their old age, and I don't mean to sound compassionless, but they would complain about their neighbors, which isn't very altruistic, and some of these people said things like the Holocaust was punishment to Jews for deicide, the crime of murdering Jesus Christ, which is very shocking, especially because these people risked their lives to rescue Jews. So, of course, these comments were very rare, but they led me to believe that maybe the altruistic personality wasn't the sole factor for explaining why people rescued. And I came to these thoughts that that the only thing that ultimately united rescuers was a morally absolutist approach to rescuing, where rescuing was this goal that was absolutely impossible for them not to work towards. And it was very consistent with Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, where a deontological view where there was a rule that you had to follow, and that rule was rescuing. But Kant's categorical imperative is very fascinating because it doesn't allow for things like lying, whereas rescuers lied all the time in order to successfully effectuate their rescue operations, which led me to my fourth idea, that moral absolutism that rescuing was actually more. The mechanism behind rescuing, I suppose, was this sort of moral absolutism, but through relativist and consequentialist means, where people looked at the ultimate goal of rescuing and ultimately worked towards that goal, even if the means weren't necessarily considered morally acceptable. For instance, people were willing to prostitute themselves in order to get money or food in order to make their rescue operation successful. And the final thought is that I discovered this brilliant book by a scholar called Monroe, and she believed that moral identity was very important for rescuers. That was their ultimate motivation, and she referred to the work of three important psychologists, Colby and Damon and Augusto Blasi, who suggested that people integrate specific values into their identity, which I hope we can talk about during the discussion. And that's basically it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.